Well, welcome back. We're talking about the question of corporate corruption in the United States. Let's get back to our panel. And Bart, you were talking a moment ago about the impact on consumers here in the United States. What about the impact internationally? I mean, there are many companies outside the United States, many individuals outside the United States that invest in companies here on the stock exchange here. They're affected as well.
Sure. Anybody that owns Wells Fargo stock was affected. I mentioned American investors. The largest investor in Citi, I think, is somebody from the Middle East. The fact that we are an American nation of American banks is really a false premise, because this is a global market, right, where we actually don't know who the investors are. Most investors, as we know, are so-called beneficial holders. So I own through Schwab. Wells Fargo doesn't even know I'm an investor, and Wells Fargo doesn't know that who their investors are if they are beneficial holding through a third party.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Richard, let's look at some of what's being done in the United States to counter this. I mean, we have congressional hearings. We saw a bit of that in our report at the beginning of the show, where we had Elizabeth Warren, a Democrat senator, questioning the chief of Wells Fargo. And I'm just wondering, to what extent is this theatrics that we are seeing in Congress? I mean, is there anything that comes out of these hearings?
Well, I think when you pull the curtain back, I mean, we have the sort of political pressure that we talked about before. That's certainly well exemplified by those Senate banking hearings. But if we look at, again, some recent changes at the Justice Department, they recently brought in a compliance counsel. So this is someone who rose up through the Department of Justice, but she also had a few chapters of her career as a compliance executive working for large multinationals. Because the compliance department in a multinational, whether it be Wells Fargo or Mylan, they're supposed to be the gatekeepers of legal, ethical, and compliant behavior, and they're supposed to have a line of sight into the business. Whether it be incentive strategies, business practices, they're supposed to see what's going on. And the Justice Department hired someone to look at those systems, to analyze the culture of compliance, and to see if these multinationals are really embracing a culture of compliance, right, in terms of an ethical workforce.
Yeah, and the reason I asked that question, because if we look at what happened in Congress there, we had the chief of Wells Fargo, as I pointed out. I mean, he lost his job, he was humiliated, right, but he still walked off a very rich man and free.
Yeah, I was going to say, the idea that he walked off a very rich man, I think it's very poor consolation. I don't think any CEO, I think any CEO would gladly give up tens of millions of dollars to not be drummed out of their company the way Chairman CEO Stumpf was. The idea that these companies are going to be somehow driven to better behavior by legislation, I think is kind of a fool's errand. I mean, when, right, your company's stock price drops 10 to 20%, that's all that the senior executive team or the board or the investors need to hear before they begin implementing changes. And they're in a position best to implement the changes that need to be made. A lot of laws that are passed on top of that are generally just piling on. Mm-hmm. They're designed to stop bad people from doing things. And most of these scandals that we're seeing are not necessarily bad people doing things. It's good people getting trapped in perverse incentives, right, doing bad things.
Richard, if we look at the case of epi-pen, we talked about that earlier on, and we just, let's look at the pricing here. Here we had a product, a life-saving product, where the price was increased 600%, as we pointed out. It was selling here in the United States for something like $600. Yet that very same product sells in the United Kingdom for around $100. I mean, how does one explain a price discrepancy like that?
Well, I don't know that you can. And Mylan recently paid almost $500 million in a settlement with the Department of Justice because they were overcharging the government for many of these products. So I think that's a case, again, where you look at the executive compensation structure, where apparently there was an incentive plan to double earnings over a 5-year period. And if management didn't achieve 90% of that goal, there would be nothing paid. So it was a win big, lose big bonus plan. and look at the unintended consequences. And again, you had some bad behavior being hidden behind good performance, and look at what happened.
Mark, we've been hearing a lot during this election campaign about corporate malfeasance. We heard Donald Trump accuse Hillary Clinton of malfeasance by making these speeches to Wall Street companies behind closed doors for which he received hundreds of thousands of dollars. We've got the election coming up in 2 weeks. After that, do you think, in the new, whomever becomes president, do you think that's going to change?
At the end of the day, the laws really are not all that effective. And I take issue with what Bart says. I don't believe that it's because the government doesn't want to enforce these things. I think that almost borders on like a reverse conspiracy theory. I think it's because the problems are much more difficult than the laws can really address.
But do we see these kind of corporate scandals in other parts of the world? I have so much trouble keeping up with U.S. scandals that I can't actually tell you that Iceland is worse. Iceland, by the way, jailed 76 of its bankers. It's one of the few countries to respond in what I think is the appropriate way. Deutsche Bank is riven with problems. They've already begun to, in the final stages of settling the mortgage securitization, much of which took place in the United States. But their trading desk runs wild, I'm told, with prop trading. The company is worth extraordinarily little. I don't think Americans have a monopoly on greed. I think it's correct that some of our incentives have gone off the rails. We are far more in love with stock options, apparently, than the Japanese or many European firms. Highly inappropriate for banks, which should be more risk averse than, let's say, an entrepreneurial firm. I mean, healthcare is an entirely different level. In one sense, you would argue it's a public good. So where we see a public-facing and public good-producing company colliding with bad incentives, I think, is where the scandals are most intense.